Yeah.
So, what was next on our list of things to cover? Brilliant. Forms of government. Right, have you got anything specifically to say about that, Sully, or shall I take it?
Forms of government is this is in like yeah. So the forms of government. So my notes in this are actually a bit fractured, but we want to talk essentially about stuff like the use of constitutions, the roles of monarchies at least nowadays because we have constitutional monarchies that are nothing like the absolute monarchies of our previous times. We don't have the monarch having absolute powers anymore. We kind of just use them for like a ceremonial role in most cases nowadays. We also want to talk about like republics and stuff. So I can get onto that right now. So um, within representative democracy, there is an extent to which the the power in the system is abstracted away from your average person after they send off their votes and get the person elected. And within that political establishment, what happens is we don't really want them to make a decision that could massively, impede on the political rights of the people. For example, we don't want if there was a majority within the UK Parliament or whatever, or like there was a majority anywhere in the political system saying we should kill this entire race of people, we would want something politically to stop that from ever happening, even if there was a political majority allowing it for it to happen. And the way we do so is we have a constitution in most cases across the world. Whether they're written or they're unwritten, there is some, in most cases, an element of constitution. And those provide a legal basis to a political system, saying, okay, within the democratic process, you need to adhere to these, individual rights. And you'll always hear about, for example, the American Constitution, which makes sure that basic civil liberties and basic human rights are respected within the democratic process. The president of the USA can't just go and um, reinstate some, a horrendously tyrannical political circumstance or bring about a dictatorship by means of popular votes. You just can't do that. And that's actually a good thing for preserving human rights and democracy. And so, yeah, that's essentially the idea of a constitution.
But of course, that does have its
Um,
downsides as well, in as much as political action can be very slow. For instance, there was a bit of
yeah,
the Constitution that argued that the Commerce Clause. They basically are. I cannot remember too well. They basically argued that the government didn't have the right. They made the point the government didn't have the right to intervene in the internal economy, um, and that it should be left to the state governments. And they had to take a very loose reading of another bit just to allow the very usage of government power at all. And because they didn't have a majority to repeal that part of the constitution, so it can be quite a impediment to social change, as is being felt perhaps at the moment with uh, uh, things like the filibuster in America, and so on. But like you said, um, uncodified constitutions, which or the lack of a constitution at all, like we have in the UK, as in we have an uncodified one, um, means that we don't have all our constitution in one document, and it doesn't have greater power than any other part of our law, which means essentially that, according to many people, we live under an elected dictatorship. So the we elect a government and they pretty much have free reign. They can be held to account by the things like the Supreme Court, but they can equally just rewrite the rules to change that and so on. The problem that it faces, of course, is that if it just vote one day in Parliament for a dictatorship, it would face mass protests and perhaps a military refusal to follow those orders, which is part of the kind of the more practical side of political engagement. You can't just flick a button and hope that you get the ends you want, even if you have all the control in the world. But it does mean that, though obviously that's the bad side, that they can just put in charge whatever they want. That specific government can without having to, get a large majority or a large percentage of the population. At the same time, um, it does mean we can have pretty fast change and it can evolve quite quickly. Whereas things like the US Constitution are pretty slow moving. They were written back 300 years ago, 250 years ago. and haven't changed too much since then, which isn't necessarily a great thing. And you've got in France, for instance, their system where they have to they've had 5 French republics because for various reasons the other 4 have fallen apart, and they've had to update it, each one with kind of a revolution, as it were, um, in the political system that they have. Um, so there's that kind of dichotomy between the evolutionary uncodified one and the more one big leap at a time that you might get for a codified constitution system. Um, and these are kind of the way in which the rules of the game that the state must play by, and citizens must play by. But there's other ways in which the governments are formed. Well, government derive their rules and so on from. Would you want to go on to talk about the other things, Sully?
As in republics and constitutional
Yeah,
monarchies.
yeah,
Okay. So, in regards to, we'll later talk about the division between the executive, judiciary, and legislature. Um, but essentially, we'll talk more about things like head of state in relation to that as well. But in our modern society, we do have essentially the role of head of state and head of government in a lot of countries, and this kind of system is what we call a republic, wherein the the ownership almost of the state has been taken from a private position of, a royal family owns this country to the public now owns this country, and we're going to elect a head of state, we're going to elect a head of government, and they're going to do our functions for us, and we're going to have a fully democratic society wherein we have sovereignty. On the other hand, the UK actually, you probably know, still has a monarchy, but it's definitely nowhere near the autocracy that we had back maybe in the Middle Ages or whatever. And that's because the role of monarchy has fundamentally changed in the UK, and we live in a constitutional monarchy, wherein the monarchy, or the Queen, essentially right now, doesn't actually have the power of a normal political leader, but exerts power uh, in accordance to our current constitution and does very specific roles. So, for example, the Queen doesn't have that much political power, but she does do things like, appoint people, to the Supreme Court, for example, and she has roles within the Church of England, and she acts as a symbol of national unity, and she appoints the Prime Minister after they're elected or whatever. She has very specific roles that we've delegated for her, um, and she acts as our head of state, which is another issue. We could talk a lot about should we have a monarchy in the UK or should we become a republic? This is an issue that crops up in the media a lot. And yeah, essentially that's just the difference between a constitutional republic and a constitutional monarchy.
yeah. That's key because obviously there are good things about us having a monarch, which is we don't have kind of abuse of executive power directly from there. Although we do have abuse of executive power in the form of the cabinet, for instance. But we have similarly lesser compared to perhaps America. But there's also bad things. Why should this person, the Queen, have such an influence? Even if it's small directly, but still have some influence when they're completely unelected and only there because of their fortune that they were born into. So we've heard recently about things like the Queen lobbying for tax changes that protected her and her estate. So the fact that one individual and one family can have so much power raises questions, but there are nonetheless benefits to that as well. But obviously that's counterposed with just a monarchy in general, which, as Sully pointed out before, the interests of the country are not a public matter; they are a private matter. The lands of us well, sorry, this is true of a constitutional monarchy as well. Sorry, but as in the monarch themselves has total or much larger control over the way in which the country is run. So monarchy systems today, I think, exist in places like Bhutan, um, where there is this one individual, one member of one family that has such influence as to effectively decide the laws of a state. Though they may be obviously tempered by national councils and so on. that provide some guidance. Um, but yeah, those are kind of the big main forms of kind of liberal government. Obviously, as we went on before, there's autocracies and so on. But often autocracies can be kind of republics. Um, so you get, the People's Republic of China. Of course, it pretends that it is operating like a republic with the interest of the nation being the the public's thing. But of course, in reality, they are kind of the private interest of the Chinese Communist Party instead. So that's just one example of how you can kind of fuse multiple variants and the forms of government do have some influence, but they are often well, in fact, they have a lot of influence, but they can be changed and broadly, it's their power source. I would argue has a much larger influence on how those countries are actually run. Britain is more similar to America, despite us being um, uh, despite us being both being America being a presidential system and us being a parliamentary system, then Britain is compared to um, Thailand, even though we both have a constitutional monarchy. Because in Thailand, they've got a semi-dictatorship, whereas both Britain and America, we are democracies. Yes. Cool. Would you like to add anything else, Sully?
Um, I was just gonna say, oh, an important distinction to make is some of you may have seen, the videos by, for example, the propaganda channels like Prague EU, who will say things like the US is not a democracy, it's a republic. And a lot of people should make sure they don't actually make this error of assuming democracy and republic are are like in any way reflecting the same part of politics. Democracy is about people having the power to make decisions. Republic's about the people's actual sovereignty and control over the state in relation to is the monarch at the top as our head of state, or is an elected head of state at the top? And so democracy and republic is compatible. Most of us, well, at least not the UK, but the America's a democratic republic, and a lot of most places nowadays, most liberal democracies are democratic republics. So they're not mutually exclusive. They're pretty much compatible in terms of values.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's an important point because that's often used as a kind of attack by certain people when, as people mention, a democracy and so on, and they argue actually America's not a democracy at all. But it kind of definitely is if the whole electorate has a vote and the electorate is the vast proportion of the population. Anyway, so we're on to the kind of the last two big sections now. So we've got stuff about the economic relations and the systems of distribution and their impact on political systems, and then we've got some philosophy of it all, which we've kind of alluded to and often directly mentioned throughout. So do you want to talk about some of the systems of distribution, Sully?
Yeah. So throughout this episode or this podcast, episode, we've talked a lot about how how society has economically changed since its start, and we had, of course, what many thinkers like Marx would actually describe as gift economies in the tribal societies. Moving to feudalism and then uh, mercantilism and then modern capitalism. And you might ask, so what are the big economic ideas in regards to economics and philosophy nowadays? And those generally are the ideas of capitalism, socialism, and then the things that are derived from there. So things like anarchism, things like authoritarian communism or Marxist-Leninism, things like right libertarian philosophy, such as the ones we'll talk about later, Nozick's, for example, libertarian philosophy. But yeah, so in regards to capitalism, at least, after the introduction of capitalism, as devised by the thinker who essentially brought about capitalism and wrote about it, Adam Smith, since then there's been a lot. Well, even during that era, there was a lot of critique of capitalism. by people like Marx, like Engels, like anarchist thinkers at the time, even by Adam Smith himself at times. He actually talked about there actually are some issues within the capitalist system in appealing purely to profit and sometimes not actually caring about the needs of the people. He critiqued his own philosophy within. He critiqued the idea that perhaps capitalism could go wrong within the Wealth of Nations, as he wrote it, which is essentially the book that founded capitalism. And so from these critiques came about these systems. And the general definition of capitalism nowadays is essentially one wherein we have a market economy, um, where you have two essentially divisions in society. You have those who own the resources, like factories, like companies, and essentially from the position of ownership, get people to work below them, and they make their money from taking a cut of the profits produced by hiring people. That's what Marx and other people called the bourgeoisie. And the other division of people within society are the workers, the people who they don't own what we call capital really. They don't own the what we call the means of production, which is the means to go and produce a product. They don't own the factories that produce products. They have to be the workers at the factories. And so what workers under capitalism have to do is they have to sell themselves to a company. They have to say, "Hey, I'm going to work for you because I need money to pay for food, and you're going to can you pay me a wage, please?" And then there's a dynamic between the worker and the enterprise, wherein the enterprise has control over the worker and decides exactly how much that worker is given. And Marx and other people saw an issue with this. They saw, hey, isn't it kind of unfair that most of us spend most of our lives inside, these workplaces, and yet we have essentially no power over how these workplaces are run when we're the main contributors to how the companies work, Like if you look at Amazon, for example, the bulk of Amazon's you know, development as a company, the way it runs, if you took away the CEO from Amazon, very little would change about how Amazon functions as a company in relation to how products are actually produced and how the service is given out. On the other hand, if you took away all the workers from Amazon, it would stop running in an instant because the workers are actually integral to how the firm works. And so Marx said, hey, maybe the workers should have, a democratic say almost in how these companies and these things are run. And he also said stuff like, hey, maybe we should stop producing things purely for profit, which is essentially under capitalism, things are produced things are produced under capitalism in order to try and make profit. This is called the profit motive. And he said maybe we should produce things for use rather than just profit, so that we can actually cater to the needs of people. And with all these critiques coming together, um, create a new system called, all the ideas of a new system called socialism, where the workers had something called the means of production, which essentially says, hey, instead of a select ownership class owning all the factories, owning all these things that produce goods, maybe the political democratic process under the workers should actually own this stuff, and that the workers should have the means of production so that they themselves can collectively work together in these factories. And instead of spending most of their lives, having what we call the labor surplus taken away from them by their CEOs, they should have control over that. And maybe we should start producing things for use. And from there was born the socialist political theories and the critiques of capitalism. And then, of course, in defense to all these critiques of socialism, was born, new forms of capitalism, especially things like social democracy that we see today, a mixed economy structure, to try and respond to the anti-capitalist critiques without actually dismantling capitalism. And then you had some people who said, no, actually, the issues that you see within capitalism are fine and they're actually good and they're necessary for our human rights. And actually, we should have less government control in our lives. We should reduce taxation. We should have companies being able to do whatever they want because that's my human right. I should have the right over my personal private property. And that's how you had a lot of right libertarian thinkers as well. Um, but yeah, essentially, that's how it all works.
But do you think you can directly relate that to the political systems of the various different economic systems, as it were? So I suppose, well, I can have a go here. So I suppose capitalism relies on a liberal concepts of right to private property. So the state as the arbiter there. Um, Socialism, on the other hand, would say that personal property should be, uh, sorry, owned by individuals, whereas private property should be owned by the masses. And it depends on which variant you follow, but you could see that in support of a state, but not quite as policing a state as exists today. Anarchism, meanwhile, conceives, which is, well, I suppose it depends on which variety, but most forms of anarchists are similar, share a lot of socialist tenets. Um, they conceive of the state as the monopoly on violence. That's kind of an important thing. That's how Nozick conceives of it to some degree as well. Um, and they think that that monopoly on violence is unfair and should be got rid of. So they, under their system, there would be no state, since and violence should and power should be shared between the actual communities rather than by some far off enforcer of political power that they believe the government represents. So you can see how the various economic thoughts influence the development of the political systems. And actually, just going back again, I suppose socialism, the fact that that you believe in the social ownership of the means of production means that you also are likely to believe in the socialization of economic welfare. Sorry, not welfare as in like the welfare state, but just general benefit and so on. Anyway, and so that encourages under most forms of socialism, a larger expansion of the state. Um, and but but at the same time, since socialism would generally treat everyone as having an equal part to play in the democratic process, given that they were all individuals within a society, that does raise some issues of where power is controlled. You know, it's now all in the hands of this democratically elected under socialism, but still, nonetheless, kind of total state. Should we build up alternative power blocks like they are under capitalism in the form of private businesses and so on as a countervail? And most people would argue that, well, most socialists at least would argue that that you can place enough regulation and checks and balances to prevent the growth of this all powerful, almighty, hungry state. But nonetheless, that is an important issue that that any person who wants to enact such radical economic change needs to discuss about its impact on the very political system of that country. Cool. Anything
Yeah.
else?
Um, I was just going to clarify that. Um, yeah. So socialism came from capitalist critiques, and sorry, essentially critiques of capitalism. And yeah, so we discussed anarchism essentially, but it's the modern sort of support for socialism doesn't really come that much in because if you looked up the history of socialism and just generally because of history in schools and stuff, you'll generally think when someone says socialism, you'll think of communism and the violent, well, not violent, but the revolutions that occurred in the 20th century and the oppressive totalitarian regimes that occurred as a result of those of the push for socialism. And a lot of people essentially associate socialism with those things, but most socialists to some extent stepped back after seeing what happened in those authoritarian revolutions and said, hey, maybe a group of people who say they're on, doing stuff on the behalf of socialism, having control over everything is actually contrary to the desires of socialism. Maybe maybe the Soviet Union was bound to fail because it was a dictatorship, not because it was socialist. And so a lot of people have resorted recently, at least after these revolutions and the failure of authoritarian communism, to what we see nowadays, democratic socialism, which is essentially building on top of modern notions of social democracy, trying to transition the economy from a capitalist one to a socialist one through social democracy and extension of its principles, as well as people who have turned to libertarian socialism, also known as essentially anarchism, who have tried to um, make the state essentially wither away by making the government so catered to the people that there isn't actually any state above the people. And we could talk, forever about whether this is viable, whether this is a good idea, but essentially those are the principles of the people involved. I think would you say we've covered everything? Should we move on to philosophical
Well,
underpinnings?
I just say that again, the under the Marxist conception of how you transition to socialism, the state would be used as the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to push forward the changes that would be necessary to bring you to socialism. And so Marx wasn't very clear on that, didn't give too much advice about what that dictatorship of the proletariat would actually be. But um, again, that's another way in which the political systems are molded even, to support the economic system that he and others wanted to see in place. Brilliant. Um, yes, let's move on then. Let's talk about the philosophical underpinnings. So, I mean, for most of history, the state was underpinned by the idea that kings were God's representatives to be given the power over the world, by virtue of them having greater moral character, and the kings thinking of them as the best people to have, and their families would being only the spawn of these great people would similarly possess such great instincts as well, and thus that's why they should have control over um, the countries and the areas that they run. But as we came into a more world that had a lot more atheism in it, that kind of runs into a fair number of problems. Because once you have to stop justifying the rule based on God, then what is the point of the state at all? Why should it allocate resources? Why should it contain an army or a military and so on? Um, uh, and
Yeah.
that brings us to various questions and about philosophy, which we'll talk about now. So you want to talk a little bit about various justifications for and
Yeah.
ideals for what the state should do?
Yeah. You cut out a bit on my end just there. It's the point. It won't be on your end, but um, essentially, I'm guessing you asked me to transition from the divine rule of kings to how we've the modern conception of the state.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, um, nowadays we don't generally justify the state based off a sort of divine rule of kings sort of theory because we don't actually have kings in power really. And plus, most of us, well, not most of us, but most people don't believe kings are representative of God anyway anymore. And we started throughout, philosophical history to actually start justifying the state through different means. And one of those means was social contract theory, which was pioneered by people like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. And they essentially said, so what is the point of the state? You know, um, and they sort of came to this conclusion, many of them, at least, yeah, most of them came to this conclusion that the reason why we have a state is because we actually make a social contract with the state. We give up some of our liberties, the liberty to kill like other humans, the liberty to steal from other humans. We give up some of our liberties in return for the state to protect us, to give us, a social safety net, for the state to protect us using the legal system. And when we give up those liberties for the better of our condition within society, that is the point of the state. It's that relationship between us and the state, and giving up some liberties. And Hobbes saw this as Hobbes the philosopher. He wrote this book called Leviathan, where he talked about social contract theory. He saw this as very, very important because he saw humans as essentially brutes. He talks a lot about the state of nature, and he saw humans as, violent creatures who, before government, didn't have any way of controlling themselves. They would war against each other. They would kill each other. They would steal from each other. They'd engage in indecent, terrible acts that I won't talk of. But what they would do is they weren't civilized. And so Hobbes said, hey, so at least the state, they gave up their liberties to do these vile, immoral things and are now much more civilized in that relationship with the state. And that's essentially the foundational principle of social contract theory. There's been a lot of elaboration on it by all these thinkers. Actually with Locke, he developed his whole idea of liberalism actually from social contract theory and his ideas on social contract theory. So it's very interesting, and you can probably add more to talk about that if you want, Tom.
Well, another key thinker on the continent side was Rousseau, who um who like Locke did conceive this state of nature in which there was a lot of violence, um, and and kind of wanted to justify why states should exist, even though he thought most of them weren't justified. He thought that they had to have the consent of the governed in order to be so, because he felt at the moment that most states wrapped up their members in chains. I think the famous quote is. Um, uh, Humans are born into freedom, yet we live in chains today. And he wanted to know whether we could reconcile the state with our freedom, and he felt we could. His ideas were mostly around things like um, the fusion of all our separate interests into one general will, which favours the whole of the community rather than just individuals, and wasn't just a question of adding up particular preferences and so on, but was rather what would benefit the most, benefit all in the social sense. So his ideas around that are interesting, but they have been known to provoke some support for authoritarianism. For instance, I think it was Guevara, that might have been Castro, and a Cuban revolutionary used to go around walking with a copy of the social contract, which is perhaps Rousseau's defining work on social contract theory, hence the name, um, and and the fact that it supports the conformity of everyone to this general will and kind of suppresses pluralism, means that I was often noted to be criticisms that it supports authoritarianism, which are interesting, and I think that's quite important when discussing him. Though I think I agree with many of his observations, that the only way a state can be just is if it has the consent of the governed, and any rights that we give up in order to be part of that community are returned through the greater strength that be and the benefits that being in such a system would allow us to be. Cool. Anything else?
Well, I'll talk about. I've got some other stuff I want to talk about, but just leading on from there, yeah, it's the whole idea of consent of the governed is essentially what drives Locke within his writings on liberalism and finding and talking about it and defining it philosophically. And it's very interesting to to see how, you know, in one of our in our previous episodes we talked about existentialism and Nietzsche, and he talked a lot about how during the Enlightenment, essentially, the values had devalued themselves, which we took to mean essentially that the Christian value of constantly seeking truth had led to people refuting the nature of God and saying, actually, we don't believe in God anymore after we've gone and looked for the truth. And essentially, Nietzsche talked about how people's moral principles and everything was deteriorating and how we don't know what direction to give it for society. And it's interesting to see how from there we moved to social contract theory and how that set the way that paved the way for liberalism. And liberalism essentially the defining feature of most of our democracies nowadays, focusing on stuff like secularism, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the importance of democracy, the consent of the governed, human rights, civil rights, all that stuff. So I think it's quite interesting to talk about that. But I think we have generally covered social contract theory and liberalism now. So should we move on to another part of philosophy?
Well, yeah. So I suppose we can talk about Rawls for a little bit, given that he kind of
Yeah.
worked from social contract theory. So he was a liberal, and towards the end of his life, probably a socialist. Um, and he thought that the state. He again moved from this idea of being in the state of nature to, well, under what circumstances would we accept having our liberties constrained by such a thing as the state? And he argued that if we existed with this, what's the word? The curtain of ignorance. What's the is there a,
The veil
the
of
veil of
ignorance, the
ignorance?
original
The original
position.
position. Thank you. If
Yeah,
you
no worries.
if you wanted to build a political system that would move away from utilitarian ideas of it just promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but was instead, um, because that had opened itself up to criticisms about the tyranny of the majority. Um, he would argue the best place, the best thing that you could do in devising this political system, where you wouldn't know where you'd end up, you didn't know if you'd be a starving beggar or the richest king of all, would be to support a society in which the greatest focus was on the poorest and the most vulnerable. That everyone was uplifted with a focus on the lowest down. So when you were born into a system, and being born is fundamentally morally arbitrary. You know, you don't choose your parents. You don't have any say at all in which part of the world you're brought up in and which class you're in. When that morally arbitrary thing happens, you want to be as part of a society that favours the lowest as much and more than it does the richest as well, to countervail for that, counteract the fact that the societies may be unequal and you're being born into them, maybe at an unequal position. Do you want to add something to that? I'm sure you understand social contract theory much better than rules and stuff much better than I do.
I definitely do not understand rules better than you. I think you've read a lot about him, I think, and you summarize his points really well. It's just it's just essentially this idea that you don't if in society if we were saying the rules for society and how it worked, and we had a completely external perspective, we would just not have any of the many of the inequalities we see in the world today. If I if there was a possibility that you know, for someone extremely rich, if they could see like a perspective of, oh, what if I was born into a very, very poor position? I think they'd be much more supporting of a social safety net. And that's why I think it's very important in the modern political sphere to actually look at stuff like the original position and how this extension of, you know, liberal philosophy coming from rules has actually really changed how we view our relationship with the state as a whole.
I agree. It's really interesting, and it's often what people use to defend the state's involvement in the economy today. You know, the idea that we have dues to the lowest of the low in society as much as we have, and that we're not just a system of individuals. But someone that might really disagree with that is someone like Nozick, who instead of basing his ideas off of Rousseau and social contract thinkers of that, more focused on other ones that such as natural rights theorists like Locke, and he devised his system, which used something vaguely similar to the original position, which was as much as what is fundamentally wrong is when one is injured or so on without recompense. And he kind of turned this to a study of political systems in general, and he argued that the state undermined that the state took away from people without then necessarily being recompensed, that it was a violation of what they wouldn't accept out in the state of nature, um, and that the only possible things that the state should be for would be for the protection of property and prevention and the monopoly of violence, the famous night watchman state that he was a proponent of. So I suppose that's key, and that's influenced a lot of people. Of course, there are others that don't take such a natural rights focus, such as Hayek, and are more focused on other aspects of, especially about markets and the economics and so on. But Nozick's ideas have been really key, especially to a more recent generation of neoliberal politicians, even who have used this conception of rights to draw away from the the role that the state should have in the economy. I mean, you can hear these kind of things in the Tory Party conference and so on, attacking the overbearing state and things like that. Although obviously they've had a little bit of a shift in recent years, and it's that kind of important. It's that's kind of the way in which that kind of more abstract philosophy has had quite a direct political impact. Do you want to add some? Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure you want to add something, Sully.
No, I mean just generally like it's very it's quite interesting to look at this modern divide between um socially at least you have of course like the liberal conservative divide, especially in like America. But it's very interesting to see economically the liberal conservative divide in many cases between social welfare and driving liberalism in pursuit of something like the original position or the veil of ignorance, and another interpretation of the foundations of liberalism, which is hey, we have a right to property, and on top of all that, the state should get out of the way of my normal life and should let me run my business without constantly being a burden on me and taxing me and forcing me to give back to the state. And many this idea that taxation is theft is very key to thinkers on the right, the Austrian like economists and all that. But yeah, I think we've essentially covered all of that. So should we move on? Let's move on to ideas of well, the only in terms of philosophy of politics, the only other things I wanted to cover perhaps were one we've already covered it actually, so we don't need to talk about it. But we could note that there's a lot of philosophy that's founded our political system in the sense that Nozick, that the philosophy we were just talking about, the anarchist philosophers. Marx was a philosopher. Adam Smith was a philosopher. You have mercantilism, and the transition from mercantilism to capitalism was actually aided by a lot of philosophers, like Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Mill. All these philosophers. But on top of that, yeah, I wanted to talk about Plato's ideas of philosopher kings because I think it's really relevant to, and we've really discussed it a bit, but perhaps we could talk about how Karl Popper blamed Plato for the rise in totalitarianism in the 20th century, because essentially these dictators in the 20th century, people like Stalin, people like Hitler, what they saw themselves as were benevolent dictators. They wanted, they thought we're better than all those, people who, through their democratic process think they're doing what's best for society. I know what's best for society. I'm going to engineer the best society for everyone through my dictatorial rule. And so Karl Popper criticized Plato, and many others, criticized Plato as well, and defended democracy, as we talked about before.
Fantastic. Yeah. Um, I think that's kind of that's interesting. Not. I mean, I can see some of the reason why Plato could be held responsible, but that's an interesting defense there. Sorry, attack on Plato there. Um, were you going to add anything else, or shall we move on to the last kind of section about the nitty gritty bits
Um,
of
yeah,
politics and government?
oh, sorry. You were cutting out on my end, so I didn't hear that you were speaking. But yeah. Should we move on to the next section?
Wonderful, cool. Okay. Um, so the biggest kind of issues with the way in which governments are run today, perhaps, is the division of, well, what is belonging to the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So, Zoe, do you want to explain these separate parts, or shall I?
Um, if you want to, you can, but I'm also happy to.
Well, I'll go ahead and have a little bit of a go. So, the executive is the kind of way, the part of the government that actually implements the laws and puts them into practice rather than just being rather than the other parts which develop them and so on. So that in Britain is something like the cabinet and the Queen. So the Prime Minister is the Queen's minister within Parliament, which is an interesting way of doing it, and again that's a way in which it's a role that's kind of developed gradually as opposed to being definitely assigned. Like the American system, which I'll explain now, which is where the president is the source of executive power. Why you hear about things like executive orders, or I think it's executive agencies, which are the president's designed federal agencies that follow through on the things that he signs into law. The legislature, on the other hand, is the body responsible for devising these laws and holding the executive to account, making sure that, well, hopefully ensuring that the democratic will is followed through. Although, of course, there are plenty of legislatures in non-democratic countries. They'll have committees that will be responsible for different issues, as well as a general kind of congregation of them that will vote and pass different legislation to support differing issues that need to be addressed within society. And then the third branch is the judiciary. So that is the people that hold the executive mostly to account, and the people as well, to make sure that they don't they keep in line with the rules that have been set up by the executive. So the judiciary ensures that is the police and the justice system, which ensure that no rules are broken in the creation of new rules, but also that the rules are actually followed through by the members of that society. And that the problem is that often these can, and there's been a very separate distinction between them in a lot of, especially Western political thought. So in America, it's very clearly cut. You've got the Supreme Court and the lower courts and so on. You've got the Congress, the Senate, and the state legislatures as the legislative branch, and then you've got the executive branch, which is concentrated in the president or in the governors of the various states. That's very clearly cut. But nonetheless, there are issues there. For instance, the president has quite a large degree of power, more power perhaps than the original founders of the American Constitution would have liked them to have, and more than perhaps they were entitled to. But due to gridlock in Congress, they have gradually gained over the years through different readings of how the Constitution should be read. Whereas in Britain we have a kind of mixed executive and legislature, the Prime Minister and his cabinet, which is the way in which the executive power is influenced, it is pushed, also sits in the House of Commons, and thus are key to the actual development of the laws themselves. And then the judiciary as well. How much power should they have? Generally, judges are unelected. I mean, when was the last time I heard of an election for the Supreme Court of the UK? Well, never, because that doesn't happen. How much influence should they have? And that again goes back to the whole idea of constitutional versus codified versus non-codified constitutions. In a codified system, these judges have a massive impact. You hear about it all the time when they talk about the Supreme Court in America and the influence that has, and the way in which people get very worked up about it for very good reason, because it's a very important thing. Whereas the Supreme Court in Britain, I mean, you might remember Lady Hale, I believe, was very important around Brexit, but the fact that we have a non-codified system means that their influence is pretty minimal, and when it comes to the actual power of the government itself, and that's not so. And really, we do have a very, very strong legislative branch in this country, which is also reinforced by our nature of our devolution, where we have mayors in the executive branch. Where we have things like the assemblies of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which feature a very strong legislative branch and not so much a strong executive branch. And whilst they've been making amends with that, especially Wales, which was not very developed particularly well in its beginnings, and with the new mayoral system across the country, it's a slow process. But nonetheless, a lot of people would argue that actually giving that much power to the legislature is kind of a good thing, since it does mean that they are addressed democratically compared to executive systems, which are often quite prone to abuse. Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah. Uh. That's you basically just covered the entirety of legislature, executive, and judiciary. I was gonna add something. Let me try and remember. Oh yeah. So I was just going to mention that something we actually could have talked about in our philosophy section. I forgot actually talk about is um is Max Weber or however you pronounce it. Um, who was a sociologist, a German sociologist, in the 20th century, and he talked a lot about bureaucracy, and he critiqued how it undermined the democratic process. And we could actually, apply some of those critiques to how the UK handles this tripartite system of legislature, executive, and the judiciary. Because, for example, you can see in the executive, well, we obviously have a massive part of the executive that is bureaucratic, which is the civil service, but that's pretty standard. The judiciary, we have the Supreme Court, the ministers, or not the ministers, but the justices um, of the Supreme Court are generally appointed by the Queen. Well, she's advised by the Prime Minister at times, but they're generally appointed by the Queen. And even in the legislature, while in America you have the House and the Senate, in the UK you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the House of Lords is, completely bureaucratic and appointed by the Queen rather than elected by, your average person. But at least, the UK has resolved some of those issues to some extent through things like 2005, I think it was. Before 2009, essentially, we didn't have a Supreme Court because um, we essentially let the top of the judiciary branch be delegated to the House of Lords, and also, but then we separated them for the Supreme Court, which essentially gave us essentially resolved some of the bureaucratic issues. In addition, we made the House of Lords much weaker than it used to be, and the House of Lords can't really, it doesn't have as much power now as it used to. It's essentially, though it is, though the House of Lords is like de jure the higher chamber, it's essentially a secondary to the actual House of Commons.
Yeah, and that's been the unimarxural versus bimarxural. I don't know. I've never heard it pronounced.
Bicameral.
Bicameral. Thank you. Um,
Yeah.
Models are very interesting as well. You've got kind of an often push to unicameral ones, um, by a lot of people because of the conflict that you get between like things like the Senate and the House in America. But in Britain, whilst the House of Lords is pretty non-political currently, although obviously that could change and has been changed in the past, um, that there isn't such a push for it. Although there is still a large push for an elected House of Lords, and should an elected House of Lords come in and clash with the elected, sorry, House of Commons, that could raise some interesting issues of whether the UK should move to a unicameral system. Um, but again, that raises its own issues as well, as have been seen by Wales and Scotland, and their lack of kind of oversight by another branch. So it's quite an interesting
Yeah.
question, I'd say. Um, but it's kind of a practical thing. But Weber makes an important point, kind of more sociologically. Um,
Yeah.
what else is there to talk about? Should we talk
So,
about devolution? You seem to like to talk about that.
yeah.
Go on. Tell us
Well,
about devolution.
in terms of devolution, you're definitely well more way may I can't speak way more well informed on the reality of like the British political structure in relation to devolution. But essentially, just devolution is this idea of the powers essentially that we have held by the government are we do provide for checks and balances through um, through actually in this country the House of Lords, and we have it through the tripartite system of legislature, executive, and judiciary. But also we should also try to appeal to people's political needs on a local level. So what the government's done is they've engaged in devolution, which is this idea that we should take some of the powers that the government has, and we should pass them locally onto, to local officials. For example, uh, like Greater Manchester has some political power to actually make decisions and manage their own budget and invest in like recently we've invested in like transportation and I, like, for example, use commonly the R pass, which is a great solution devised by people like Andy Burnham. And so what the government's essentially done is given some political power to local government in order to create the system, essentially make it more democratic and feel better on a local level.
Yeah, and that does work on a local level as well. But also, in America, for instance, the fact that there's so much power at the local level kind of hamstrings broader attempts at reform countrywide. So there are benefits and costs to it as well. I mean, for instance, I don't know, in Belgium, where they have three separate systems with they've got they're split into three different regions, and then there's the federal government as well, and they've got three different language communities that are all represented in various parliaments and so on. The fact that that's the case, whilst there are obviously benefits to each individual community having its own political engagement, it has led to more fractious politics and to a lack of kind of countrywide power, which has meant that Belgium has often not seen a government for very many years. So, whilst I really do think devolution is a force for good, it does have to be handled in a way that doesn't lead itself to such unintended, I believe, consequences. Yeah, fantastic. Um,
Um, yes,
so
so
the
go
last
ahead.
2 points on our list are about elections themselves, and they focus on how we should get our leaders in. So the current system used across a lot of the world is first past the post, and that's a way that basically favours geographically bound uh, MPs, members of parliament, or what are they called, congressmen, legislative people, assembly members, I don't know, legislators. That's the word I was looking for. I'm sorry for the extra 10 seconds of confusion that you, the listener, may have had as I stumble around like a blind elephant trying to find the word. So, whether we should elect people on this geographical basis of first past the post or on another basis is a key issue, and it's very important at the moment. There's a lot of support in the UK for a proportional representation system, but the obvious problem is that the people that support proportional representation generally aren't favoured by the current system, so won't get access to the tools of power that will allow them to implement it. Whereas in Europe, most governments do possess some form of proportional weighting and so on. For example, mixed member districts. So you've got an area of the country that has multiple representatives. So I don't know if 20% of they often it's a thing that's common in places like Ireland. So let's say 20% of Dublin the South votes Fianna Fáil, then they even though and then 40% votes Sinn Féin. On that basis, then Sinn Féin would win the election, but in the mixed member districts, you'd get a Fianna Fáil one as well as two Sinn Féin ones, and then I don't know, one Fine Gael and
Yeah.
one I don't know People for Profit or something like that. I don't know. I'm just making up random instances there, and I'm sorry to any listeners from. Did I say Belfast South? Dublin South, I meant to say. If I did say Belfast South, I'm very sorry there. um, it means that you get a more proportional result. And then you've got things like additional member systems, such as you have in Scotland and Wales. But those and in Germany, where you've got constituencies and then you've got additions to them that try and make it somewhat more proportional. The German system is very interesting in as much as the size of the legislature can vary by hundreds of seats depending on how proportional the results of the constituencies were to the actual popular vote, and that generally means that it's very, very, very proportional. But it also has its downsides in as much as the you lose a lot of it's a bit more chaotic in terms of the numbers, and also you lose some degree of connection. While you do have one constituency MP, they are kind of often outweighed by the hundreds of ones that are only linked to one state in general, rather than to a specific community. Um, and then there also is on a utilitarian basis, is PR the best thing? Proportional representation, that is. Well, I mean, it was a proportional representation system that led to Hitler's rise in Germany. It was a proportional representation system that has allowed, places like, well, Germany again, to see the rise in the AfD. But at the same time, proponents of PR may say, well, first past the post has been no different. You just had the far right of politically extreme elements infiltrate mainstream parties, such as the Tory party's shift to the right, or Donald Trump's election in the Republican Party. And so that raises a lot of questions, and it's kind of one of the key issues of political science at the moment, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the last point there was just about should you make a decision geographically or kind of across the whole country. So I think they do in Israel. I may be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure they count the whole country as one constituency and way up there. So it's very, very proportional. But it also means that you get about 60,000 parties, which means when you don't have one dominant one, as they kind of fall in the Israeli Labour Party or the kind of hovering of Likud, the main party now, has been, that means that coalitions are quite hard to form. So perhaps first past the post systems do allow more stable governments. So it's a matter of normative preferences. What do you want? A more proportional one that represents voters' interests better, or a one that perhaps in the long run will guarantee people more stability and better outcomes, I suppose. Were you going to add
Yeah.
anything, Sully?
I was just gonna say, yeah, that's a very good summary of proportional representation and first past the post voting.
Thank
Sorry.
you very much.
Um, so I was just gonna say, with first past the post, that's what you call essentially a plurality system, wherein higher number of votes than everyone else means you win, essentially. And then proportional systems are proportional systems, essentially, proportional representation. But I don't know, did you talk about majoritarian systems and like ranked voting? Like as essentially systems wherein you need a majority to win. Did you mention
I
that before?
didn't talk about that, no. And go on, speak about that, because that's quite interesting as well.
Okay. So many countries actually have a ranked voting system wherein um because essentially the idea is in these countries you need a majority to win. So like you'll need a majority to win. What they'll do is they'll have either ranked voting or they'll have perhaps several rounds of elections. So in a several rounds of election system, essentially, if no one secures a majority in the first round, they'll eliminate the bottom few candidates and then they'll do the entire system again. Um, and essentially, um, people who were voting for like, the lower candidates, they didn't get that many votes, will be forced to pick a candidate like that was more popular, and they'll essentially express their political view on the candidates that might actually get elected this time. So that will bring someone up to a majority in most cases, and then you'll be able to do a majoritarian system. On the other hand, there are ranked voting systems, wherein you have to essentially on your ballots, you might have like five different political candidates for your constituency or whatever, and you have to rank them in order of which ones you'd prefer. And so, if your first choice does not secure a majority, but your second, and isn't it like if your first choice, if your first choice is counted and it doesn't produce a majority, then your second choice is counted, and if that produces a majority, then that second person gets elected, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Tom.
yeah, pretty much. It's until you get a more than 50%. um, they keep just getting rid of the lowest placed candidates until eventually the
Yeah.
preferences add up to a majority. Um, yeah. So we have some degree of that. Like you said, in Greater Manchester, for the mayoral ballot, you rank two parties. Um, but the fact was that Andy Burnham won a majority on the first ballot, so there's no need to count the second preferences. But some things, you may have like 15 preferences, which again, it may open itself up to problems there because you don't want to rank someone who might do well, who you don't like, high up there. But then you also need to know all the different your stance on every different political candidate, which may not be possible when you're a busy person. So again, that's part of the bureaucracy of politics, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Um, does Germany ever like for their election? Did they have a majoritarian system?
No, they just
Or
have one constituency ballot and then one
okay, okay.
proportional ballot. I believe I'm very confident on that, but I might be wrong. So commenters,
That would make
please fact
sense.
check us.
Yeah,
If you've
that would
watched
make
through
sense.
two, listened through 2 hours and 7 minutes of it, then you can listen to that.
Yeah. So have we covered? We've essentially covered to some extent geographical, social, and individual voting power, right?
I'd say so. Yeah.
I would
I
say.
mean, there's other
Uh,
things like national minorities who might get a go, um, but that's national minority. Like, so for instance, in Germany recently, the Dutch, no, not Dutch, Danish speaking minority, got a seat even though they didn't win enough to get them over the proportional threshold. Um, so that's an example where the governments can get involved to favour one sector more than another, perhaps for political reasons, like they want to support the interests of minorities. You get a lot of things where there are a certain number of allocated to minorities, especially in Eastern Europe. I think it's quite popular because there generally has to be one dominant ethnic group and then some smaller ones who may be drowned out, especially in such a region that's kind of often dominated by ethnic tensions. Um, but that's just another way of counting things, and there have been various systems in the past. I mean, like, well, it's not for government. The Labour Party used to have an electoral college, for unions, MPs, and members. That's a way of assessing and valuing the various additions that each group makes. Or in America, the very fact that states get a big say in what happens is quite interesting. It's the fact that they get to vote rather than just purely individuals. Is another example of a slightly different way in which figures are elected. But yeah, there's quite a
yeah,
small point, but it does have interesting consequences.
yeah. And also, I was gonna say you can yeah, as you've definitely covered, you do often see mixes of different electoral systems at times. Like I was reading earlier about some systems which have you do your standard ranked choice voting for your local area, for your local like constituency, and then you'll have to vote for alongside that on your ballots you'll write down the political party that you'd like to win on a national level, and that would be I'm guessing a majoritarian system on that side, but then on your local level, essentially it's the division between the approach there.
Yeah, yeah, you get that. I mean, you can have hybrids of all of them. A lot of this discussion has been about the various forms of voting. So you have things like single transferable vote or ranked choice voting, and so on. But you can have combinations of them with different ways in which the politicians are elected at all, such as proportional representation or and things like that. So it is interesting, and it does raise a lot of questions. But people are generally kind of conservative about it, even though most polls suggest people do favour PR here. For instance, they voted down the AV thing in 2011, alternative voting, that is. Um,
Hmm.
and that was often because it was seen as, well, it's not really full proportional representation. But that was still a way of getting closer to proportional stuff, and that was voted down. So it's quite interesting. And people's ideas of who politicians should represent, just on an individual basis, who each politician should represent, contribute quite a lot to uh, our, our understanding of how governments as a whole should work and whose interests they should favour. For instance, on a geographical level, since the only MPs for the government are in the areas they want, should the government just favour the people who voted for them, or should they favour the whole country? And generally, the conclusion is they should favour the whole country. But the geographical link means that you get things like pork barrel politics and so on, which contradict that. Yeah. Go on, Sully.
Yeah.
Anything you've got else to add? Because I think we're coming to the end.
Yeah, I think we've essentially covered everything. So I think should we wrap up the episode?
Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed this installment of the New Dogs Old Tricks podcast. I hope you've learnt at least a decent bit about politics, and we haven't been rambling on for too much, uncontrollably. I was gonna say, what's it called? Have we decided on maybe what we want to do in the future, like a next podcast or anything?
No, we haven't, but it is your choice. So
It is my choice. I will have to think a lot about what we'll do the next episode on. There's a lot of things we could do in philosophy, but I think also we've started to branch out to just covering almost like academic, interesting topics as a whole, just critically looking at these things. So I think there's a lot to pick from, and I'll have to think about that. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. We hope to be going back to, routine podcast hosting and releasing.
yeah, I really hope we
Yeah,
do manage to do that. It's just about when we can get around. COVID's not been helpful, holidays haven't been helpful, and so on. But hopefully we'll get back into it.
yeah,
It'll be cool.
yeah. And also, what was I gonna say? I don't know if this is longer or shorter than the existentialism episode, or was it the ethics episode? The one which was horrendously long.
I think that was
But
ethics. Yeah. So if you're
how
if
long
you're
is it?
listening now, you're doing very well. Anyway,
So you go ahead.
if you're listening to it now, dear listener, you have done very well in getting this far, because you've been battling through 2 hours of it. So that's quite well done.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's time to wrap up the episode. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you next time.
Yeah, I hope to see you next time. Take care and stay safe and enjoy some philosophy and politics and so on in this episode. So, right.